The reason why I'm connecting these two big ends of this continuum is because everything that we've been talking about here leads to great or stronger, more efficient auditory processing skills for breaking that code into literacy.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, but here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, so let's get started.
Worry is just a natural part of becoming a parent. We worry about our child's safety, their overall health, their well-being. We often worry about our child's future, even when they're just a baby or a toddler. We worry about the self-esteem. Will they make friends? How will they do academically? Even when you look at your baby and toddler today, you might be thinking, how the heck will they do in school? I didn't do well in school, or perhaps your partner didn't do well in school, or perhaps you had social anxiety because you felt less than capable. Well, today's episode will focus on how we can ease that worry right here, right now. I will highlight some specific things to focus on today to reduce the chances of falling behind, and that you look at your toddler and say, nope, I'm going to keep you on course and I know how to do this. That we can look at building your confidence, mom, dad, grandparents, that you know what to do before things start to go awry. And that's really my whole purpose about this channel, my podcast and my videos and my future courses, and all of this is really about helping empower you, focusing on early child development, how eating helps foster growth and development, talking and play, those three main pillars, how we wire the brain, that we're building neural pathways through everyday activities, and that you can keep your little one on track developmentally in this kind of chaotic modern world. And I bring this to you today because there's some current news going on that I don't think is very new or current, but they're using different terminology. They're focusing on how we can structure academics differently to help kids stay on track, mostly through literacy, reading and writing skills. And I've been seeing this popping up in the news over the last week or so, and I'm thinking to myself, laughing, chuckling, frowning, sometimes even screaming, because I'm like, holy cow, here we are once again debating how to help kids, quote unquote, break the code to literacy. They're now referring to it as the science of reading. And I laugh at this because, as you all know by now, I've been around for 35 years. And back in the mid 1990s, so 1996, 97, there was a company called Scientific Learning Corporation. You can just Google them. I'll supply some links so you all can look at how these things are all connected. They introduced a product. It was a computer-based product. It focused on language processing, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. What is language processing? How does auditory develop in those early years? But what this program, Fast Forward, and it's a little play on word, is FORWORD instead of forward. But the key here is that we, through neuroscience, and I say we only because I was one of the few private clinicians that really embraced this new treatment program, And I say treatment because it was a tool using the computer to help kids physically change the structure of how well they processed or heard and interpreted sounds within words and words within sentences and sentences within stories. And it was this really new phenomenon at that time in the 1990s where neuroscience, and I've shared this with you before, and technology kind of came together for the first time in everyday lives for private practitioners like myself, even public schools, and the everyday mom and dad who learned about this and really brought it home with them. And we can talk about the do's and don'ts and what worked, what didn't work. It was really remarkable, and they're still using it today. It's just that the school systems pushed back remarkably hard that they never really properly used it because they feared, believe it or not, that teachers would lose their jobs if the computer or computer-like programs could teach kids, and I use those in quotes, but teach kids or build their auditory processing skills well enough that then reading became more accurate and fluent and all of this. And we can talk about what that is. But my point here today is it's coming back full circle, right? So the last 100 years or so, we've had these reading wars, and you parents and grandparents. So, I'm talking to a mom or dad who's about 30, give or take, and their parent who's in their 50s or 60s or grandparents. So we've been all raised with these reading wars coming at us, right? Where we had phonics, we had whole language, and currently through Common Core, it is called the balance approach to reading. And again, I shake my head. I knew this years ago when Common Core came out, looking at we're missing the mark once again. And it makes me incredibly frustrated. And yet I know that some families, some communities were pretty tenacious and kind of worked around the weaknesses that the public school systems continually, I think, get stuck in. So what does this all have to do with toddlers and babies? Perhaps you might be asking, like, Erin, I'm trying to get my 1 or 2-year-old to say his first 50 words. Erin, I want my 2-year-old to start using 2-word phrases. Well, the reason why I'm connecting these two big ends of this continuum is because everything that we've been talking about here leads to great or stronger, more efficient auditory processing skills for breaking that code into literacy. And I've said this my entire career, and I've worked privately, I've worked in private schools, I've worked with families and other clinicians trying to help spread the truth about what is now being so nicely, and I say this with a smirk on my face, but that is now being so nicely referred to as this quote unquote, the science of reading. But what it really boils down to, and what I want you to walk away from today's episode, is everything you do with your baby and your 1 and 2 and 3-year-old is laying that foundation to really strong literacy skills when they're 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. The reason is because 80% of learning how to read, breaking the code, and we can talk about that a little bit today. I'll touch upon it, but I can go into greater details later on. But 80% of breaking that code comes from auditory processing, is how well your kid, your child, is able to listen for the sounds within words. And how we do that is by building the auditory cortex. So that's like the part of the brain that wraps around your ears. That's the whole auditory cortex, the temporal lobe there. And we do that in real time. We do that when we coo and play with your baby those first couple of months. We do that when we teach them peekaboo and little nursery rhymes that we talked about in previous episodes. We're exercising literally, and we found this out in the 1990s, how we can change the structure of the auditory cortex with language processing. It's not really a muscle like your bicep or your quad or your trapezius muscle, but it's a network of systems that has to go through experiences to wire and rewire an efficient network. We knew in the early 2000s, or many of us who understood what it took to break the code and how early speech and language really does lay that foundation. We also understood that kids who had speech and language delay, even if they caught up by the time they reached kindergarten, even if they tested out, right? We gave them a standardized test, their vocabulary, their grammar, and all of that seemed within the average range, right? And so there's a big range there from 25th percentile to the 85th percentile. But that's a range of quote unquote average language skills. But we knew those kids who struggled with early speech and language were in a significantly riskier group for breaking the code. And we know this through the neuroscience that came out of the early 1990s, that it's a timing thing and that kids have to be able to pull the sounds out of the words in real time in order to understand how to sound out a word or to blend the sounds in order to read, or what we call decode, right? If they're looking at a word and it says, cup, and he sounds out k, can he blend it together to say cup? And that's part of the phonics. But in order to get to phonics, we need what is known as phonological awareness. And that's the area where you all, when you're a parent of a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, you're exercising their auditory cortex within the realm of what we call phonological awareness. And all that means is that your 1, 2, 3-year-old, through your guidance, is becoming more and more and more aware of the parts of language. And I will have some links on my description down below so you can then get definitions of what this means. Because what I want to encourage you, challenge you really, is to never give up with the nursery rhymes or the repetitive books that you're going to read 1,001 times over and over again. And the reason why talking through narration and parallel talk and modeling and expansion, all of those strategies that I've talked about before in the past, why that's important is because you're literally exercising that auditory cortex to build his or her ability for phonological awareness. And phonological awareness is really understanding, like I said, the parts of language. So, for example, when a child is, I'd say, 2.5, pushing 3, you can start playing around with how many parts are in this sentence. The cat is black. And you can jump up and down and count the cat is black. There's 4 parts to that, right? Or you can clap with your hands, or you can throw a ball. What you're doing is exercising his auditory attention to the parts of the language. And the language is a sentence. The cat is black. But there are words within that sentence. Cat and black are the primary words, but the cat is black. Can he auditorily track that? And then is he auditorily aware enough that these words have a beginning and an end, right? And that's all through real-time talking with you. And it makes me excited that the schools now are coming back to reality and that phonics is key. But you don't want your first grader or second grader to be faced with quote unquote phonics training in school if they have a really weak auditory processing system, right? And they're struggling with not being able to do it in real time. That's why I want to help you go back and feel really, really confident in these nursery rhymes because you're training the ear. Think about that when you say Old MacDonald for the 50th time. Old MacDonald had a farm. There's a timing to it. E-I-E-I-O. And what you're helping them is attending to what you're saying. You're coding his natural language, right? His native tongue. And you're helping him process. Yes, it's slow when they're 1 and 2 and 3 years old, but you're going to play around with that timing. Just like think about someone learning how to play the piano. Those chords are going to be slow and laborious in the beginning, and then they will build up fluency and speed and competence and all of that beautiful music with practice and practice and practice. And what we're doing with the ears now from birth, actually in utero, again, remember that your baby can recognize the biological mother's voice, within 20 minutes of birth. They can recognize that. That's auditory training in utero. Some of the key factors that we learned in the 1990s and early 2000s that was repeated over and over again is that 80% of learning how to read is auditory. They have to be able to perceive the sounds in words in order to blend them or sound them out or spell them. It's not visual. And so the whole language stuff that came out, I think it was in the 70s and 80s, that was not very effective in teaching kids how to read either. And we can talk about what is and is not a sight word. And I can tell you how I think 92% of the so-called sight words are really decodable, which means that we can sound them out. For example, the sight word and, right? So most teachers say, yes, the word and is a sight word. No, you can sound it out accurately. And. That's decodable. That's not a sight word. Yes, we see it 1,000 times, and so we have now coded the visual representation A and D, and so it's automatic, but we can teach that by sounding it out. Those strategies that I've talked about in previous episodes, especially the last couple of ones, with narration, parallel talk, modeling, expansion, follow his lead, get him or her to build that engagement, because that's auditory processing. That's social engagement. Nonverbal and verbal. He's building those networks every time he plays peekaboo with you, or every time he dumps out the box of blocks and then puts them back in. Ask them those open-ended questions, not yes, no. Give them choices. Do you want your blue PJs or your green PJs, right? Play with your voice because that's much more interesting. And so they're going to auditorily attend to you. There are actually 4 main steps to auditory processing, or also known as listening, right? Your listening skills. And I can create a handout of these just so you can easily have them at your fingertips and just be thoughtful. But right now with your toddler, it's really about building that first step, which is auditory awareness, right? And he's starting as babies, you know that they start to localize that sound, right? And then they start to really build that auditory attention. So can he or she attend to you when you're singing songs with them and tune out what's going on in the background? That's that auditory figure ground, right? And that's all regarding auditory attention, the first step. Hey there, Mom. I just wanted to jump in and ask a big favor. If you're gaining benefit from these episodes, please consider leaving me a review. It's the only way I can expand my reach and find moms and dads and grandparents just like yourself. I'd be so grateful. I'll leave a link down below in the description to save you an extra step. So thanks in advance. Let's get back to today's episode. And then the next step would be auditory discrimination. And that's when your baby's beginning to hear environmental sounds, right? And even inside your house, he'll hear a siren or the trash truck, or your partner, mom or dad, come home and they hear the garage door, right? So that's discrimination within the environment. And during all of these beautiful opportunities that he's experiencing with you and in your various environments, they're also building what we call suprasegmental discrimination skills. And what that really means is it happens more or less on the right hemisphere, where they're coding the rate of our English language, the intensity, the duration and pitch, and that they get a sense of prosody. And those are all the nonverbal elements to speech. And every language has its own rhythm. Sometimes you and I, if we only know a little bit of, say, French or a little bit of Spanish, and we think that they're talking so fast, but what it really is we don't know enough to follow along. And so it sounds like it's exceptionally fast. It's just that we can't process and interpret it in real time. And so that's why a lot of times our toddlers will appear like they're not, quote unquote, paying attention to us or listening, but we might just be talking too much and too fast. That they're still at that 50-word level. They have a handful of vocabulary words, nouns, and a few verbs. And so they're trying to process, think of the brain as a decoding machine, right? A computer. And they're trying to keep up. But if we talk too fast or too much and keep changing it up, then they're not going to be able to process and keep it up, right? But the other element that falls under the auditory discrimination, which is the step 2, is really looking at different speech sounds within the word. So this is when even a 2-year-old, because you've read so many nursery rhymes and you've read so many books, think of Dr. Seuss, right? And that you've really exercised and built those neural pathways that they can hear the difference between ship and tip, that SH, sh, changes the meaning of the word. That the ip part in ship and tip, the only difference is that first sound. And although a 2 or a 3-year-old can't tell you why or how they are different necessarily, but a 3-year-old certainly can tell you whether they rhyme or not. They might not be able to explain what rhyming means. And I've done this. I did it with my daughter, and then after that, I've done it with probably hundreds of little kids to see how early can a child learn how to rhyme. And it is not uncommon for a child who has pretty good language Doesn't have to be exceptional, but you can teach the concepts of rhyming between the ages of 2.5 and 3. They might not explain how they rhyme, the first sound in that word changes and everything else stays the same. But they have the awareness that they rhyme because they can contrast it against two words that don't rhyme. So if I say, do ship and tip rhyme, they could say yes. And if I said, does cat and house rhyme, they'd say no. Right? And so it gets a little dicey if the first sound is the same. If I said cat and cup, they might get a little confused there. But what I'm saying is that a 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4 can easily learn these phonological awareness elements through your everyday experiences. And you're building that foundation. Think of building a house, right? You're building everything on solid ground, and it doesn't matter how many floors you want to build on top of it. It's solid. And so when I look over my years with a first grader or second grade struggling to learn quote unquote phonics, you can't teach them phonics, which is let's sound out this word or let's blend this word. You can't teach them that if they don't have the fluidity, the auditory fluency of those phonemic awareness. And I do have a guide on what are the primary precursors to making a strong reader. And I will have that link in my description below. But step 3 would be auditory identification. So then that would be when they're a little bit older, right? When they're 5 and 6 and they're being able to say, what's the first sound you hear in the word cup? And they would say k. And it's the sound, not the letter. And then the 4th step would be auditory comprehension. That looks at comprehension of what the message is or the conversation, following directions, organizing steps, but it's also auditory closure, which in a different episode I can dive deeper into these elements. But for your child, your 1, 2, and 3-year-old, it's all about doing exactly what we've been talking, singing nursery rhymes, reading books, helping build that vocabulary. That first year, 14 months, 16 months, is about the gestures, right? And putting sounds into those approximations. It's about building his or her receptive language. You all know if you're in the middle of it, then your 18-month-old, your 24-month-old, they understand a heck of a lot more than they're able to speak. But somewhere between that 2nd birthday and that 3rd birthday, really things start to explode. And there are a couple of things developmentally or neurologically that's happening. One is called fast mapping, and I can define that later on, but there's a lot of higher order deductive reasoning going on that an average child will learn 9 to 10 new words a day. So if you take a 2-year-old who has about 50 words and then you build this rich, beautiful language home environment with him or her, and by their 3rd birthday, they have close to 3,000 words. They've learned about 9 to 10 words a day through life experience. And again, that speaks to why screen times are not beneficial. And in another episode, I've actually collected some current research looking at that. And I know it's a sensitive, sore subject, but it's really important for you to sit quietly and imagine what the future can hold. And what you want for your baby to become, right? A happy, communicative, chatty little person. They don't have to grow up to be an orator or a public speaker or, God forbid, a politician, right? But that they have competent verbal communication skills that support strong literacy. That whether you keep them at home and homeschool them, or you do a hybrid, or you private or public or a pod or a chapter, I mean, there are 1,000 different ways. And again, that can be another conversation. But right here, right now, know what you're doing is so vital to his future, academically, socially, cognitively, self-esteem, emotionally, all of that. I think you understand that, and look on what's being said in the news lately about the whole science of reading. It's not new. We've known this a long, long time. And it's critical that you, mom, with a 1, 2, 3-year-old, understand how these pieces fit together. And you've got this. Understand that reading is not natural to us human beings. We think it is because our school system, unfortunately, the people that are in charge somehow got it wrong, that we humans should automatically learn how to read just by being read to or loving. That's what whole language was that if we just read to them enough, that somehow it would happen through osmosis. Actually, I kid you not. And that's not how it works at all. How it works is that we've trained the auditory cortex, and it's really, the right ear actually has a dominance for speech and language because we're coding it into the left hemisphere for the mechanics of talking and speech and words and language and all of that. But the other nonverbal elements that I mentioned earlier when we look at what auditory processing is in the second step under auditory discrimination, that's all in the left hemisphere, looking at the rate of speech, the intensity, the duration of different sounds, right? A s is longer than a ch, right? And we have to code that. We have to understand. And there are 26 letters in the alphabet, but that we have 44 sounds in order to communicate in English. And then we have to translate that into written language, right? So it's all related. But I just had to bring this current hot topic of what the science of reading and how the schools are shifting their perspective. And many schools actually have been doing this under the radar because they knew that the Common Core method was not going to serve our children, that especially those districts that were already hurting. There's a lot that you guys can do that it doesn't really matter what they do in the educational classroom if you set your kid up today at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It does not matter if the auditory cortex is healthy and strong and that you start to use these experiences purposefully. Because at the end, I want you to sit and watch your little one play outside on the grass or on a jungle gym or in the mud or sleeping. Just watch them sleeping and know in your heart that they're going to be a confident, competent speaker that really loves and appreciates stories because you've shared the written word with them. And they're going to be eager to break their code because they have strong auditory processing skills that you have worked out through your everyday life. And that's how it's done. I promise you, that's how it's done. So I'm excited. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and email contact@higherlearning.com. or DM me, and down in the description, some links that you can get some more descriptive terms. But for now, just keep singing, keep reading, keep playing, keep up your routines. Make sure that there's not a lot of competition in the background. and limit to no screens, please, for the sake of your beautiful baby and your beautiful family, right? You've got this. So God bless all of you. I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.